Alright, so welcome back to Everdell. We're still going over the cards for the different construction and critter cards. So let's continue on where we left off. Alright, so first we have here the Fairgrounds. And it's going to cost you a twig, 2 resin, and a pebble to put into your town, or build into your town. And it's also going to give you 3 victory points at the end of the game. And it's one of those green production cards, so when you play it, and during the 2 different seasons, you'll get to draw 2 cards, which is pretty cool. And then we have the full paired up with this card here. Now, if you have the full after you build the Fairgrounds, you can play the full for free. If you don't have the Fairgrounds, it's going to cost you 3 berries to play the full. Now, the full is pretty unique, so you can only have 1 full, obviously, in your town at most, and it's not even going to go into your town if you're the one that's playing the full, because it says play this full into an empty space in an opponent's city. So that's cool. You build the Fairgrounds for your town, and then you're essentially giving somebody else the full. And the full is minus 2 points at the end of the game, so that's why no one wants the full, of course. So that's why you're giving it to one of your opponents of your choice, which is pretty cool. That's a pretty cool card. I especially liked doing that to a friend of mine playing this, and the first time I played this, I gave him the Fool. And it takes up a slot in his town as well. So, it's a double whammy. Yeah, so it's like it's like Everdell's version of an attack card. So that's pretty cool. I like that. Anyways, and that kind of is funny that the Fool is the skunk. Alright, let's continue on. Okay, so next we have the theater and the bard. These two go together. Alright, so the theater is one of those purple prosperity cards, and it's going to cost 3 twigs, a resin, and a pebble in order to build and put it into your town. It's worth 3 victory points at the end of the game, or 3 points, and then you'll also get an additional point for each unique critter in your city. So if you have a lot of unique critters, you'll get a lot of extra points at the end of the game. And then, if you have the bard as well, and you've already built the theater, you can play the bard for free. Just don't forget to put an occupied token on the bard, just like with the fool. Don't forget to do that for the fool as well with the Fairgrounds. Anyways, so the bard here, if you get to play it because you have a theater, it's not going to cost you anything, but if you don't have a theater, it's going to cost you 3 berries in order to play. Now, it's actually worth 0 points, so that's something to note. But it's interesting. Since it is a Tan Traveler card, it's only a one-time use card, you may discard up to 5 cards to gain 1 point each. So that's pretty awesome if you ask me. If you have 5 cards, or a few cards you don't want, you could discard them, get a few points, and then even though he's worth 0 points at the end of the game, there are ways of getting rid of critters in construction, so he might be one to get rid of, since he's no longer useful for anything. So the Bard is kind of a one-time useful card for sure, but it's only a one-time use. So that's something to note. And so this is an option. You might want to get rid of the Fool in your town if you have a way of doing so. You also might want to get rid of the Bard as well. So that's something to note. Okay, let's continue on. Next we have the Storehouse and the Wood Carver. You'll notice they're actually both green production cards. So, let's go over this one. It's actually pretty interesting. The Storehouse. It's going to cost you a twig, a resin, and a pebble to put into your town, and it's worth 2 points at the end of the game. Then obviously, since it's a green production card, you're going to play it when you put it into your town, and you're going to play it during both of the seasons of spring and autumn, when you prepare for those 2 seasons. So this is how it works. You'll place either 3 twigs, 2 resin, 1 pebble, or 2 berries on this storehouse from the supply. Then you can place a worker here, and that's pretty interesting because since it's not a red destination card, you can actually still place a worker on this card even though it's not a red destination card. And then once you put a worker on this card, you'll take all of the resources that are in your storehouse. So if you get to do this when you play it, and then you get to do this again when you're preparing for spring, you could have like, oh, I don't know, 2 berries and 2 resin on the storehouse. And then if you put a worker down in spring, you could get the 2 berries and the 2 resin as an example. So that's a pretty awesome card. But because it has this little worker placement, your opponent can do the same thing. He can put his worker down and take all of the resources that you were saving up in your storehouse. So that is something to note. And of course, you can do it to them as well if they have a storehouse. So careful. So careful. That's why you might not want to put the best resources in the storehouse. Maybe put 3 twigs or 2 resin, because those are easier to get. All right. Next we have the wood carver. Now, obviously, if you have the storehouse, you can play the wood carver for free. That's pretty cool. Or, if you don't have a storehouse, it's going to cost you 2 berries in order to play the wood carver. The wood carver is also worth 2 points at the end of the game. And since it's a grain production card, you're going to get to activate this a few times throughout the game. You may pay up to 3 twigs to gain 1 point each. So you could get a few extra points if you have a lot of leftover twigs. Especially in autumn, you might have several twigs that you might not use, and so you can plan ahead and pay up a few twigs in order to get a few extra points. That could be very useful. So those are two more awesome cards. Let's continue on. Okay, so this is probably one of my most favorite cards out there. The Clock Tower is a blue governance card, and it's also a unique construction, so you can only have one of these in your town. It's also going to cost 3 twigs and a pebble in order to put into your town as well. But then, when played, so this is one of those few blue governance cards, I can't think of any that's like this, but when it's played, you'll place 3 points here. When it's played, you'll put 3 points on the Clock Tower. And at the beginning of preparing for season, you may pay 1 point from here to activate one of the basic or forest locations where you have a worker deployed. So that's pretty awesome. You could have your worker sitting on the berry in a card, and you could basically get a berry in a card because you're paying 1 point from your clock tower to activate it once again, which is pretty cool. Which is why it says you do this at the beginning of preparing for season, because during the preparing for season, you're going to get all of your workers back anyways. So make sure you do this before you get your workers back, if that's your plan. And you can only do this a maximum of 3 times, so if you somehow manage to get this in winter, you can do it in spring, you can do it in summer, and you can do it in autumn, if you manage to. It's not easy, but if you manage to, that's pretty awesome. But I think I don't think I've ever actually got to build it in winter. I think the earliest I ever got to build it in was spring, and so I got to use it 2 times. But that's still awesome, getting to use it 2 times. But towards the end of the game, like if you get this built in autumn, well, you're just getting 3 points for it. That's all you're doing, and you're not going to ever get to use this ability. And if you get it in the summer, you only get to do it once, so it may not be worth it, especially since you're limited to what you can put into your town. Then, if you have the clock tower, you can play the historian for free. Just don't forget to put an occupied token in the corner of that bottom card for the clock tower in order to play the historian for free. But if you don't have a clock tower and you still want to play the historian, it's going to cost you 2 berries. And yes, I love bats, so the historian is an awesome card for me. But then it's got an interesting ability as well. So, you'll draw 1 card after you play a critter or construction. That's pretty interesting. So if you have the historian, every time you play a construction or a critter for the rest of the game, you're going to draw an extra card. Pretty much almost every time. And I say almost every time because there are some technicalities that might cause you not to draw a card. But still, that is awesome for sure. That's very useful. And he's worth a point at the end of the game. So after you've, placed a lot of critters in construction in your town, the historian might be one of those critters you might not feel too badly about getting rid of at some point. So strategy wise, but he's still usually the last choice I go for, because like I said, the Fool, the Bard, and there's a few others that are totally worth getting rid of if you can. Okay, let's continue on. Let's see if we can get one more in this video. Okay, so here we have the Monastery and the Monk. Okay, well, in order to build the monastery and put it into your town, you're going to need a twig, a resin, and a pebble. And it's worth a point at the end of the game. But then you're going to put a worker here in the monastery. But here's the thing about this. If you decide to put a worker on the monastery, the worker is going to stay here permanently. So if you put a worker here, and it's not the last season that you decide to put it here, you're not going to get it back. It's going to stay here for the rest of the game. So that is something to note. Putting a worker here early in the game is going to weaken you considerably, probably, because you're going to have less turns than everyone else. Then, if you do decide to put a worker here, you're going to give 2 resources to an opponent and gain 4 points. So if you did decide to put it there, it's still a one-time use to get the ability, because he stays here permanently. Is it worth it to get those extra points if you're doing this in the beginning of the game? No, it is not worth it. Do it during autumn. Yes, it's worth it for autumn. It is not worth doing in spring, summer, and for that matter, definitely not winter, for that matter. So, and then, if you have the monastery, you can play the monk for free. Although, if you don't have the monastery, you'll still have to pay the cost, which is 1 berry, in order to play the monk. But since it only costs a berry to play, it's not a huge problem if you don't have the monastery to just go ahead and play the monk. Now, since the monk is a grain production card, you're going to get to use this ability several times if you want to. You may give up to 2 berries to an opponent to gain 2 points each. So, just giving off a lot of extra berries, you could get some extra points. But here's another interesting thing about the monk. It unlocks a second monastery. What that means is, if you do have the monastery, if you have the monk, both of these slots here are available, and so 2 workers can go here. And then that means if you were able to put both of your workers here in autumn, out of 6, you could possibly get 8 extra points at the end of the game, as long as you gave like 4 resources to an opponent. And of course, your opponents can go here as well to try to get some extra points by giving you some resources. So that is something to note. So that's an interesting combo for sure, but definitely not my favorite for sure. Okay, we'll see you guys in the next video.